In 1835, the Great Plains of North America were still overwhelmingly controlled by Native American nations who had lived there for centuries. By 1895, that way of life had been almost entirely destroyed. The buffalo herds it depended on were nearly extinct, and the land itself had been carved up into farms, ranches, railroads, and states. This video covers the whole thematic study every exam board sets on the American West: the Plains Indians and their way of life, the settlers who migrated west and the government policies that pulled them there, the rise and fall of the cattle industry, and the wars, massacres, and broken treaties that ended Native American independence on the plains for good. We'll move through the Oregon Trail, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, Custer's Last Stand, and the tragedy at Wounded Knee. Let's start with the people who were already there. Every exam board structures this topic across roughly the same three phases. First, early settlement up to about 1862, the Plains Indians' existing way of life, and the first waves of settlers, like the Oregon Trail migrants and the Mormons, moving west and creating the earliest tensions over land. Second, rapid development from 1862 to about 1876, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, the cattle boom, and new farming technology, all pulling in huge numbers of new settlers, while government policy increasingly pushed Plains Indian nations onto reservations. Third, conflict and conquest through to 1895, the wars that finished off organized Native American resistance, the collapse of the open-range cattle industry, and the closing of the frontier itself. Keep that shape in mind: an existing way of life, an invasion of settlers and technology, and then the conquests that made the first two possible. Plains nations like the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche lived a largely nomadic lifestyle, following the vast buffalo herds that migrated across the Great Plains each year. The buffalo provided almost everything: meat for food, hides for teepees and clothing, bones for tools, and dry dung for fuel on a largely treeless landscape. Extended family groups, organized into bands and larger tribal councils, moved camp regularly, living in teepees that could be packed up and transported within roughly an hour. Horses, originally introduced by Spanish colonizers centuries earlier, had transformed plains life by making it far easier to hunt buffalo and travel huge distances, and owning many horses became a genuine marker of wealth and status. Warfare between rival plains nations was common, but it was typically small-scale, based around raiding for horses and individual displays of bravery, rather than large-scale conquest or permanent occupation of territory. Bands typically numbered anywhere from a few dozen to several hundred people, and different bands within the same nation could act with real independence from one another, choosing separately whether to trade, fight, or make peace with settlers and with each other. This was a sophisticated, highly adapted society, not the simple or static one it was later dismissed as by many settlers. Plains Indian spiritual belief generally held that land, like the sky or the buffalo herds, could not truly be owned by any individual person, only used and respected, which put it on a direct collision course with the settlers' entire concept of private, legally fenced property. Spiritual life was deeply tied to nature itself, with rituals like the sun dance marking important seasonal and life events, and with individual visions and dreams often carrying serious personal and communal significance. Gender roles were clearly defined but genuinely complementary. Men typically hunted, fought, and made major political and military decisions, while women built and owned the teepees, processed buffalo hides, raised children, and often held real influence within the wider community. Political authority was usually earned through demonstrated wisdom, bravery, or hunting skill, rather than inherited, and chiefs generally led through persuasion and respect rather than any absolute personal command. None of this remotely matched 19th-century American assumptions about property, religion, or gender. Children learned practical skills directly through daily observation and imitation of adults rather than any formal schooling, and storytelling played a genuinely central role in passing down both history and moral values from one generation to the next. That fundamental mismatch in worldview over land, religion, and gender shaped almost everything that followed. From the early 1840s onward, thousands of American settlers began traveling roughly 2,000 miles west along the Oregon Trail, seeking fertile farmland, fresh economic opportunity, and a genuine escape from crowding and hardship back east. Wagon trains, typically pulled by oxen rather than horses since oxen were cheaper, stronger, and less likely to be stolen, faced brutal conditions. Disease, especially cholera, was by far the biggest killer, alongside accidents, exhaustion, and occasionally conflict with Native Americans, although violent encounters were considerably rarer than popular myth later suggested. The journey generally took 4 to 6 months, and timing was absolutely critical, since travelers needed to cross the Rocky Mountains before winter snow made the mountain passes completely impassable. Whole families made this journey together, and it was grueling, dangerous work for women especially, who managed households, childcare, and often driving duties throughout the entire trip. Trading posts and forts sprang up along the route to resupply passing wagon trains, and a genuine, if informal, support network of guides, traders, and experienced pioneers gradually developed to help later travelers succeed where earlier ones had sometimes struggled badly. This early migration proved that a genuinely successful overland crossing to the Pacific coast was possible, which is exactly what encouraged the far larger waves of settlement still to come. The Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, faced serious, often violent persecution in Illinois and Missouri, including the murder of their founder Joseph Smith in 1844, which pushed the community to seek a genuinely remote new home, far beyond existing American settlement. Under their new leader, Brigham Young, roughly 70,000 Mormons migrated west between 1847 and the 1860s, ultimately settling around the Great Salt Lake in present-day Utah, a location deliberately chosen partly because almost nobody else wanted it. Facing harsh, dry conditions, the Mormons built an impressively sophisticated irrigation system, diverting mountain streams to farmland that would otherwise have been useless desert, and their settlement became remarkably self-sufficient and well-organized extremely quickly. Mormon society was tightly, centrally structured around the church itself, with strong communal cooperation genuinely rare among other westward settlers of the period. Mormon settlers also practiced a distinctive form of cooperative land distribution, with church leaders overseeing the fair allocation of farmland and water rights rather than leaving it purely to individual competition, which helped the community avoid much of the conflict that plagued other early settlements. Their success at large-scale desert irrigation directly influenced later farming methods used much more widely across the American West. As settler traffic along routes like the Oregon Trail increased sharply, tension with Plains nations grew, since wagon trains disturbed buffalo migration patterns and consumed scarce local resources like grass and firewood along the way. In 1851, the United States government negotiated the Fort Laramie Treaty with several Plains nations, formally defining specific tribal territories and, in exchange, guaranteeing settlers safe right of passage directly through Native American land along established routes. In theory, this was meant to reduce conflict by clearly separating settler travel corridors from tribal hunting grounds, and for a few years it did genuinely reduce large-scale violence. In practice, the United States government proved consistently unable, or simply unwilling, to actually enforce the treaty's boundaries against its own growing number of settlers, and individual Plains bands were not always bound by agreements that other leaders, from other bands entirely, had separately signed. Within just a few years, the treaty had substantially broken down, setting an extremely troubling pattern of formal, solemn agreements immediately followed by continued native land loss. The treaty also drew a hard line, on paper at least, between land reserved for native nations and land considered open for settlement, but that line meant very little once gold, railroads, or good farmland turned up on the wrong side of it. This pattern would repeat again and again over the following decades. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered any adult citizen, including women and freed African Americans, 160 acres of public land essentially free, provided they lived on it, built a home, and actively farmed it continuously for 5 straight years. It triggered a genuinely massive wave of westward migration, since land ownership on this scale was simply unimaginable for most working-class and immigrant families back in the crowded cities of the eastern United States. In reality, 160 acres often proved far too small a plot to farm profitably on the notoriously dry, difficult terrain of the Great Plains, and a significant number of homesteaders ultimately failed and abandoned their claims entirely within just a few years. Even so, hundreds of thousands of homestead claims were successfully filed in the decades that followed, permanently and dramatically reshaping the demographic and economic landscape of the entire Plains region. Many homesteaders were recent immigrants themselves, from Germany, Scandinavia, and elsewhere in Europe, drawn by the promise of land ownership that would have been completely unattainable back in their home countries. The Homestead Act reflected the era's dominant belief in what became known as manifest destiny, the pervasive idea that American expansion all the way across the continent was both inevitable and somehow morally justified. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 authorized construction of a transcontinental railroad, with the Union Pacific building westward from Nebraska while the Central Pacific built eastward from California, racing to meet somewhere in between. Central Pacific construction relied enormously on Chinese immigrant laborers who endured brutal, genuinely dangerous conditions blasting tunnels directly through the Sierra Nevada mountains for markedly lower pay than white workers received for the same dangerous work. The two railway lines finally met at Promontory Point, Utah, on the 10th of May, 1869, marked by the ceremonial driving of a golden final spike, an event that instantly, dramatically transformed travel time across the continent from many months down to under a week. The railroad accelerated westward settlement enormously, allowing goods, mail, and huge numbers of new settlers to move west far faster and more cheaply than ever before, while also directly enabling large-scale commercial cattle ranching and grain farming for genuinely distant eastern markets. Telegraph lines were strung alongside the tracks at the same time, meaning news, prices, and government orders could now travel across the continent in minutes rather than weeks, tightening federal control over the whole region enormously. The railroad also, quite deliberately, cut directly through the middle of remaining buffalo territory, fragmenting the remaining herds and accelerating an ecological collapse that was already well underway. Gold and silver discoveries repeatedly triggered sudden, chaotic rushes of prospectors hoping for quick fortune, from the Pikes Peak Rush in Colorado beginning in 1858 through to the Black Hills Rush in the Dakota Territory in the 1870s. Boomtowns could spring up almost overnight around a promising strike, packed with saloons, gambling halls, and makeshift shelters, and then empty out again just as fast once the gold ran out or a more promising rumor drew prospectors elsewhere entirely. These mining rushes brought serious additional tension with Plains Indian nations, since major strikes very often occurred on treaty-protected tribal land, and the United States government proved consistently unwilling to keep determined prospectors out once real money was clearly at stake. The 1874 discovery of gold in the Black Hills, land explicitly, formally guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux under an earlier treaty, is a particularly direct example. The government first tried and failed to simply buy the land back, then effectively allowed thousands of prospectors to legally flood in anyway. Mining also brought a distinct wave of settlers of its own, including large numbers of Chinese immigrants who worked existing claims after larger operators moved on, often facing serious discrimination and violence from other prospectors despite their genuine skill and hard work. That specific, blatant broken promise over the Black Hills fed directly into the serious warfare that would soon follow. After the American Civil War, Texas held millions of semi-wild longhorn cattle worth very little locally, but genuinely valuable in the rapidly growing, cattle-hungry cities of the American East and Midwest, creating an obvious, highly profitable business opportunity. Cowboys, a genuinely diverse workforce that included many former Confederate soldiers, freed African Americans, and Mexican vaqueros, drove huge herds of cattle hundreds of miles north along established routes like the Chisholm Trail, toward railway towns where the cattle could finally be loaded and shipped east. These cow towns, places like Abilene and later Dodge City, boomed rapidly around the railheads, complete with stockyards, saloons, and a well-earned reputation for lawlessness that has honestly never quite left American popular culture since. The long drive itself was grueling and genuinely dangerous work. Stampedes, river crossings, extreme weather, and the constant physical risk of losing cattle, or a cowboy's own life, along the way. For roughly 2 decades, this open-range cattle business was extraordinarily profitable. Ranchers organized cattlemen's associations to manage grazing rights, brand registration, and disputes between competing outfits, a rare example of genuine cooperation in an industry that was otherwise fiercely, individually competitive. This period helped build the enduring image of the cowboy that still dominates popular imagination of the American West today. Farming the treeless, often notoriously dry Great Plains required serious new technology that simply hadn't existed further east. Barbed wire, patented by Joseph Glidden in 1874, finally offered settlers a cheap, effective way to fence in land and livestock on a landscape that had almost no natural timber available for traditional wooden fencing. Windmills allowed farmers to pump vital groundwater up from deep underground wells, while new techniques like dry farming helped conserve scarce soil moisture in areas that received nowhere near enough reliable annual rainfall for conventional farming methods. With no trees available for conventional building material, many homesteaders built sod houses instead, cutting thick blocks of tough prairie turf directly out of the ground itself, which were surprisingly durable, if famously prone to leaking during heavy rain, and generally sharing space with the occasional unwelcome insect or snake. Farming life on the plains remained relentlessly hard regardless of the new technology. Crop failure, prairie fires, locust swarms, and severe isolation, particularly for women, were all extremely common. Even so, railroad companies themselves actively advertised for settlers back east and across Europe, sometimes exaggerating the ease of plains farming considerably, since more farmers along the line meant more freight and passenger traffic for the railroad's own profit. Even so, these various innovations, taken together, made large-scale, genuinely permanent settlement of the plains realistically possible for the very first time. Formal law enforcement was often genuinely thin, or simply entirely absent, across huge stretches of the early West, especially in rapidly growing boomtowns and cow towns that had expanded far faster than any actual local government structure could reasonably keep pace with. In the resulting vacuum, communities frequently formed vigilante committees to deal with theft, violence, and general disorder themselves, dispensing rough, sometimes seriously excessive justice entirely outside any formal court system. Professional lawmen did gradually emerge, particularly once towns grew wealthy and stable enough to actually fund and support them, but the popular image of a single noble sheriff single-handedly taming an entire lawless frontier town is honestly a considerable exaggeration. Cattle rustling, disputes over land and water rights, and serious tension between competing cattle ranchers and the growing number of homesteader farmers frequently spilled over into open, sometimes prolonged violence. Over time, as settlement genuinely stabilized and matured, more conventional courts, elected sheriffs, and organized local government structures gradually took hold. Dime novels and much later, Wild West shows and early films dramatically exaggerated the violence of everyday frontier life for entertainment, cementing an image of constant shootouts that most actual residents of the period would barely have recognized. The West's enduring popular reputation for lawlessness has arguably outlived the historical reality itself by a very wide margin. As settler expansion accelerated, official United States government policy shifted decisively toward forcing Plains nations onto formally designated reservations, generally smaller, less desirable areas of land, framed publicly as a way to both protect Native Americans and simultaneously free up the remaining land for settler development. The Second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 established the Great Sioux Reservation, including the Sacred Black Hills, and formally promised the Lakota exclusive rights to that specific territory in what was meant to be a lasting, binding agreement. As with the earlier 1851 treaty, this promise proved short-lived in practice. Pressure from prospectors, settlers, and often local politicians repeatedly pushed the federal government to renegotiate, shrink, or simply outright ignore reservation boundaries whenever they became genuinely inconvenient for expansion. Reservation life itself was frequently harsh, involving serious food shortages, unfamiliar and often unsuitable farming methods imposed from outside, and a severe, deliberate loss of traditional independence and self-governance. This entire pattern, repeated broken promises paired with steadily shrinking territory, fed growing resentment, and government agents distributing promised food and supplies on reservations were also frequently corrupt or simply incompetent, meaning even the reduced support that had actually been promised often failed to reach the people who desperately needed it. This entire pattern directly set the stage for the serious armed conflicts that were still to come. In 1864, United States militia forces under Colonel John Chivington attacked a peaceful, unsuspecting Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment at Sand Creek, Colorado, despite the camp's leader, Black Kettle, actively flying both an American flag and a white flag of truce above his own tent. Somewhere between 150 and 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people were killed, the clear majority of them women, children, and the elderly, in an atrocity that provoked genuine, widespread outrage even within parts of the American press and government back east. A few years later, the Lakota leader Red Cloud led a sustained, ultimately successful military campaign, generally known as Red Cloud's War, against United States forts built directly along the Bozeman Trail through contested Lakota hunting territory. Red Cloud's forces inflicted serious, repeated losses on the American military, including the complete destruction of an entire military detachment at what became known as the Fetterman Fight in 1866. The resulting 1868 treaty, forced through by Red Cloud's clear, sustained battlefield success, briefly stands out as one of the very few outright Native American military victories over the United States government during this entire period. In 1876, following the discovery of gold in the Black Hills and the government's failed attempt to simply purchase the land back, war broke out between the United States Army and a large combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by figures including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer split his 7th Cavalry Regiment and dangerously underestimated the sheer size of the combined Native American force he was actually facing. Custer's own detachment of roughly 225 soldiers was completely surrounded and entirely wiped out, an event that instantly became infamous back east as Custer's Last Stand, and remains the most famous single United States military defeat of the entire Plains Wars era. The victory, however, proved to be devastatingly short-lived for the Plains nations themselves. The shock and public outrage back east triggered a massive, sustained military response, with the United States Army pursuing Lakota and Cheyenne bands relentlessly and effectively throughout the following year. By 1877, most remaining resistance had been forced to surrender or flee entirely, and both Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were dead or in exile within just a few years. Perhaps the single most devastating blow to Plains Indian independence was the deliberate, systematic destruction of the buffalo herds themselves, which fell from tens of millions of animals in the 1850s to only a few hundred survivors by the mid-1880s. Commercial hide hunters, actively encouraged and sometimes directly armed by the United States government, slaughtered buffalo by the million purely for their hides, leaving the vast majority of each animal's meat to simply rot where it fell out on the open plains. Some American military officers stated the underlying strategy quite openly and bluntly. Destroying the buffalo would inevitably force Plains nations onto reservations, since their entire traditional way of life depended completely on the herds for food, shelter, clothing, and tools. The railroad itself directly accelerated this collapse too, splitting the remaining herds into smaller, increasingly vulnerable groups and providing hunters with fast, cheap transport for both the hunt itself and shipping hides back east afterward. Without the buffalo, genuine large-scale, independent resistance on the open plains became essentially impossible, regardless of any individual band's remaining courage or considerable military skill. By the mid-1880s, the open-range cattle industry had become seriously overstocked, as ranchers rushed to grab a share of what had looked like almost limitless, easy profit, pushing grazing land well past its genuine natural capacity to sustainably support that many animals. The brutally severe winter of 1886 to 1887, remembered afterward as the Great Die-Up, killed enormous numbers of cattle across the northern plains, who had no real shelter and had already been left with badly overgrazed pasture heading into that particular winter. Many major cattle ranching operations were financially ruined virtually overnight, and the industry that survived shifted decisively toward smaller, individually fenced ranches using the same barbed wire that farmers relied on, rather than continuing with the older, unregulated open-range model. Barbed wire fencing also increasingly separated cattle ranchers from homesteader farmers and from each other, sharply reducing the need for the great long-distance cattle drives that had defined the industry's most famous, most mythologized years. The open-range cowboy era most people now picture when they think of the Old West, in reality, only genuinely lasted around 2 brief decades. The Dawes Act of 1887 fundamentally restructured reservation land itself, breaking up communally held tribal territory into individual plots, generally around 160 acres, allotted directly to individual Native American family heads, explicitly modeled on the settlers' own Homestead Act. The clearly stated underlying goal was cultural assimilation, encouraging and often actively forcing Native Americans to adopt individual farming, private property, and broader American cultural norms, rather than continuing traditional communal land use and tribal governance structures. Any reservation land officially left over after this individual allotment process, generally the majority of it in most cases, was then formally declared surplus and opened up for direct purchase by white settlers. The policy proved genuinely devastating in practice. Total Native American landholding fell by roughly two-thirds nationally over the following decades, while many individual allotments, often unsuitable for viable farming in the first place, were eventually sold off entirely out of sheer economic necessity. Government-run boarding schools reinforced this same explicit assimilation policy, often deliberately separating Native American children from their own families, languages, and cultural traditions for years at a time. In the late 1880s, a spiritual movement known as the Ghost Dance spread rapidly across many reservations, inspired by the prophet Wovoka's vision that ritual dancing could restore the old way of life, bring back the vanished buffalo herds, and cause white settlers to simply disappear from the land entirely. Alarmed American officials, deeply nervous the movement might spark a fresh, coordinated uprising, banned the ritual and moved to arrest prominent Native leaders, including Sitting Bull, who was killed during his own attempted arrest in December 1890. Shortly afterward, on the 29th of December, 1890, United States troops intercepted a band of Lakota, led by Chief Spotted Elk, near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, and attempted to forcibly disarm them at gunpoint. A single shot, whose origin remains genuinely disputed by historians to this day, triggered indiscriminate United States gunfire that killed somewhere between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children, many of them shot while attempting to flee the immediate scene. Wounded Knee is now widely regarded by historians as marking the definitive, brutal end of organized Native American armed resistance on the Great Plains. In 1890, the United States Census Bureau formally declared that a continuous, identifiable line of frontier settlement no longer meaningfully existed anywhere across the country, since settlement had by then genuinely spread across virtually the entire continent from coast to coast. 3 years later, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued influentially that this now-closed frontier had been absolutely central to shaping distinctly American values like rugged individualism, hands-on practical democracy, and relentless self-reliance, a highly influential idea now generally known as the frontier thesis. Turner's version of events, however, said remarkably little about Native Americans themselves beyond treating them mainly as an obstacle that had simply been overcome along the way, a framing that later generations of historians have rightly and thoroughly criticized as deeply one-sided. By 1895, the American West had been fundamentally, permanently transformed. Railroads crossed it in every direction. Homesteaders and fenced ranches had replaced open-range and free-roaming buffalo herds, and the Plains nations who had once lived there freely were now confined to considerably reduced reservations. What one group of Americans proudly celebrated as the taming of a genuine wilderness, another group experienced very directly as profound, irreversible conquest and loss. So, how should we actually evaluate this period? For decades, popular American culture told a fairly simple story: brave pioneers heroically taming a supposedly empty, lawless wilderness through hard work and sheer courage. Modern historians generally take a considerably more balanced, complicated view, recognizing genuine settler hardship and remarkable technological achievement alongside the deliberate, often quite brutal displacement and destruction of existing Native American nations who had already lived successfully on that exact same land for many centuries beforehand. The core underlying pattern repeats constantly throughout the whole period. A formal treaty was signed and solemnly promised. Some new economic incentive like gold, land, or railroads then emerged, and the treaty was subsequently broken or simply quietly ignored soon after. Government policy, meanwhile, consistently shifted from relatively early attempts at negotiation toward outright military conquest and finally toward a deliberate, sustained policy of cultural assimilation, but the practical, lived outcome for Plains nations was remarkably consistent throughout, steadily, relentlessly shrinking land and independence at every single stage. This tension between celebrated national progress and genuine, well-documented historical tragedy is exactly the kind of balanced evaluation exam boards want you to demonstrate directly. So remember the whole arc: an existing, sophisticated Plains Indian way of life, an enormous wave of settlers pulled west by land, gold, and new technology, and a series of broken treaties and brutal wars that ultimately ended organized Native American independence on the plains for good. If you remember one thing for the exam, remember that almost every stage of this story looks completely different depending on whose perspective you're actually viewing it from, and top answers explicitly show that you understand both sides clearly. That's the whole thematic study in about half an hour. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist, one full topic per video, covering every major exam board in one place. Subscribe for the next one, and good luck in the exam hall.